Archaeologists really in the 19th century are drawn from countries like France, Germany, and Britain in particular. Italy also to a certain extent. So from the middle of the 19th century onwards, one of the most important archaeologists is Auguste Mariette. As we move towards the end of the 19th century, the British Egypt Exploration Society becomes very important. And they're two leading archaeologists for the first 30 years that the institution was going were a Swiss by the name of Edouard Naville and a young untrained Englishman called Flinders Petrie, who has a huge impact on all aspects of archaeology in Egypt at that time. He transforms the discipline, really.
He was a young man who was actually a surveyor, and that's why he went to Egypt. He went to Egypt as a believer in, I believe, Piazza Smith, who thought that the Great Pyramid was a kind of a message to modern man, and that the dimensions of the pyramid could speak to us about what's going to happen and our condition.
So there is some sense of cosmic connection that he was looking for? I hadn't heard that before.
That's right, yes. Well, Piazza Smith had quite a following, and Petrie and his father were members of, well, I'm not sure whether they're formal members because I thought they were Plymouth Brethren, but they were very pious Christians. Mm-hmm. And they went out to actually try to confirm Piazza Smith's allegations about the measurements. And young Petrie went out first. His father never followed him. And he did a real number on the Great Pyramid and the two other pyramids. And still his work today, his survey is invaluable. How he could do it with the limited equipment he had, I just don't understand. But then he was bitten by the bug, I guess, and the Egypt Exploration Society hired him. And he went off, I believe the next place was Tanis. Mm-hmm. And from that point on, every year he would come back and excavate in Egypt.
Petrie has a far more rigorous scientific approach to the material that he was excavating really than anybody had before. So previously archaeologists had been drawn to treasure is probably as good a word in some ways as you could use. Objects which were very beautiful, museum quality was a phrase that was often used, and also objects which were inscribed, because from 1822, the point at which the hieroglyphic script could be understood and read, this meant there was a vast quantity of information that could be had from these texts. So those things were prioritized. And more or less everything else, the non-beautiful, non-inscribed, disregarded.
What I learned about Petrie was that he took exception to all of the common things that were there. He realized there was a story that was unfolding in the dig sites.
That's right.
And people were just discarding it, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Let's talk about that.
Well, he, up to that point, people who went to Egypt to study the monuments and whatnot were really, what shall I say, they were treasure hunters. They were after the objets d'art, and they would bring them back. And so there was quite a trade in these statues and works of art and this sort of thing. And Petrie reasoned quite well that this was only the tip of the iceberg, and the life of the people, as represented by the small objects, should be dealt with as well.
Petrie is the first person really to realize that there was a huge amount to be learnt from those things, and so there was no training, there was no expertise in this. He is the man to invent techniques for gathering that material, documenting it, and interpreting it.
He was, in a way, it sounds like he was like the father of archaeology, or I mean, what would you say? I mean,
Petrie is often known as the father of archaeology. He begins his career in the UK. Most of his work was focused on Egypt and later on Palestine. But the techniques that he introduced in those places and his understanding and recognition of the importance of gathering all objects, that applies to archaeology anywhere.
And they weren't considering, they were looking for beautiful museum quality artifacts. But they weren't considering the history of Egypt.
No, The earliest archaeologists, I think it's important to remember that in Egypt, archaeological material is very, very abundant, and beautiful stuff is very abundant as well. And in many cases, it's so abundant that it kind of defeats, it's defeated archaeologists. So why would you go for anything other than beautiful things and inscribed things, especially when, I don't mean to denigrate, the information you can get from texts. There is a huge amount to be learned from those texts. It's just, I think, that Petrie recognised that if a man had the energy to consider the textual, the beautiful, and everything else, then there was more that could be gathered. And he's the first person to have that energy and that appetite to deal with everything.
What did the role that Petrie's wife play in a lot of this? Tell me about her.
Oh, Hilda. Yeah. Well, she had been, she was working, I think, in the museum in London. And he was there with her, and they were both thrown together, in fact, in their work. And then
They fell in love that way?
well, it was love from one side. It was Petrie's love for Hilda. Hilda
Really?
was just not outraged so much as totally surprised and blindsided by this offer of love and marriage and whatnot. And she rejected him at first. And Petrie said, "Well, I'll have to go to the ends of the earth to get away and to, somehow
Very
come to terms
poetic.
with this." Yeah. So eventually, he just bore down on her, and she said yes, and so they got married.
They were a pretty good team, weren't they?
Oh, they proved to be, yes. I mean, she was a bit of an artist, I think, and he was a surveyor, so he could do his own plans. And she went out with him and braved all sorts of dangers.
Petrie's wife, Hilda, was a very important presence in his life, and from the time they became married and she began to accompany him on expeditions, a very important part of the archaeological process as well. He, of course, as the man who was already a great archaeologist by the time they met, remained the man who took most of the credit at the time. They lived in a patriarchal world in which the great man, the great figure, was very much the way things were understood and done. But Hilda often was the person, while Flinders was back in the workroom documenting objects, she often was the person actually on site supervising the work, and she played an enormous role in supervising and controlling that process. And as now we have begun to look back on Petrie's archaeology, it's clear actually that although he was a great pioneer and although he was a great leader and innovator, he wasn't flawless in his methods, and he was very much an objects man. And a lot of what we understand from the context of those objects, the archaeological site from which those objects came, a lot of that work is actually being done by Hilda. And so
his wife actually had a lot to do with what?
She was an enormously important presence. Yeah, absolutely. She is responsible, perhaps not quite equally, but they more or less were a double act after a few years. And so I think, yes, I mean, whatever Flinders achieved in the second half of his career was equally something that his wife was responsible for.
It didn't come in for criticism, but maybe some of his contemporaries looked down their nose at him, especially Naville. Naville destroyed more than he discovered.
Who was Naville?
Naville was a Swiss Egyptologist, actually, who was hired by the Egypt Exploration Society to go over and dig up Pithom, route of the Exodus, all of this. And in later years, he was very, very careless in his treatment of monuments. And at the site I'm now excavating, Mendes, he excavated there for a very short period of time and discovered a room with papyri in it. We don't know how many papyri, maybe over 100, rolled up in scrolls. They had been burnt in a conflagration, and that, strangely, had preserved the papyrus. With difficulty they could be read. Petrie knew what he would have done if he had found these. He would have initiated conservation almost immediately. But Naville was not interested. And out of that room, there came only about 10% of the totality, and Petrie was livid.
Because what, they just destroyed it? They just threw it in the
he just ignored it. He was not a conservationist. He could not handle it, and he didn't care. So he left it. Naville had a rule, in fact, on his dig, that no workman, of course, he in the old days when he alone was the Westerner and you had maybe 150 workmen, no workman should come to him with a monument, a fragment of a monument that was less than 50 centimeters in any direction. Anything less than that, he'd throw it away. You can imagine what he threw away.
Yeah.
Oh, God. I mean, inscriptional material, too, that would interest me is gone. So
you almost have to excavate the dump sites.
Exactly. Yes, you do. And I have, not his, but some others whom I won't mention, and found things that they didn't know they had thrown away.
Yeah, yeah. Kind of like a garage sale.
Yeah.
You know, someone else's treasure is someone else's trash, right?
That's right.
Petrie was clearly an extraordinary man. Extraordinary in terms of the energy that he brought, the innovation. He was relentlessly inventive in establishing new ways of recording what he wanted. But he wasn't just somebody who documented things and then was happy to pass on the information to people to interpret. He had very clear ideas of his own about what the things that he was finding could tell us about Egyptian history and about Egypt's role in Near Eastern history as well. And a lot of his work, in fact, particularly in the 20s and 30s, was what he called ancient Egypt across the border. And he was particularly interested in Egypt's relation with the cultures of the Levant at that time. And I think Petrie, along with many scholars in that time, would have been very aware of the Old Testament narrative. And I think his own religious beliefs, although they're not often very much brought to the forefront in his work, there's, I think, no doubt that they will have influenced him to a certain extent in his interpretations. He will have had in mind...
He would have been mindful of that, wouldn't he?
He would have had in mind the Old Testament narrative when he was working at these sites. And there's no question that the archaeological sites he was working on, the material he was uncovering, did help us to understand where what the Old Testament narrative was based on.
I know that he found what he, I think, felt was one of the most significant finds was the Israeli stele.
Yes. Petrie's discovery of what has become known as the Israel stele in Thebes, a long way to the south of the border between Egypt and the Levant, has become one of the most iconic objects known from ancient Egypt. It's a stele of the early 19th dynasty. What is important about it is that it appears to be the earliest text which makes reference to Israel, Israel not so much as a land but as a people. What's really interesting about the hieroglyphic inscription is that it very clearly writes the characters which we would read as Israel, but the determinative sign at the end, where normally you would expect a place name or a name denoting a people's or a place, you would normally expect that in the Egyptian to end with a sign signifying a particular aspect of geography, a city or a mountainous land, something like that. In the case of Israel, the determinative sign is an image of people, perhaps conveying the idea that this is a people without a particular place at this time, and perhaps a nomadic people.
Yeah. So there's some pretty interesting objects here.
Yes, objects here are just a tiny fraction of the total number of objects which are found at the site of Cahoon, which is it's the site of an ancient village which was constructed around the pyramid of Senusret II, one of the 12th dynasty pharaohs. So very approximately, these objects are something like 4,000 years old. What was special about Cahun is that it was a place where people lived, and it was preserved extremely well. By and large, we don't have a great deal of evidence for the places where people lived, and the evidence of implements and objects of daily life like these, which give us a bit of insight into how people lived and what they were doing.
And Petrie was the one who uncovered this.
Petrie was the one who uncovered these objects. It was Petrie's great gift to archaeology, was in understanding the significance of objects other than the very most beautiful or the inscribed. It was Petrie that had the vision and the energy to understand that the less prepossessing objects like these could nonetheless reveal a huge amount about how people lived in ancient times, a long way removed. And so,
what is this right here?
This is a plumb bob, which would have been used in
hung down.
Absolutely, yeah, hung down to which would have been used in construction and design. So it's very much a part of the building process. We have here a chisel as well.
It looks like you could have purchased that from the hardware store not too long ago. And it's remarkable.
It's in very good condition.
Yeah.
And again, this is not the kind of object that would have been of interest to people before Petrie's time. But it's an object which would have been used. It's something which was very much a part of the story of how something like a pyramid would have been constructed. And so to have these implements which would have been used,
some type of a knife here?
Special, yeah, some kind of a knife. I'm not absolutely sure how this one would have been used, but again, very much a part of the everyday life of the people who lived in this place.
Let's talk about this tent peg.
And this peg is a fascinating object. Considering that this is made of wood, it survived incredibly well for 4,000 years.
I find that amazing.
There's no question what it would have been used for. It's not so dissimilar from the kinds of pegs that you would use today.
You would think that it potentially could have come from the 1800s of our time period, as opposed
absolutely. It would probably, obviously, we have to treat it with the utmost care here. But it's something like this would function very nicely as a tent peg today.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I've heard about this for several years now, and to see it myself is really special.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing.